Good morning, Shabir. Thank you so much for making yourself available for this interview, especially after a very intense week. We just completed a week of our annual selection committee meeting, and you've come all the way from South Africa, and this is very valuable for us. Thank you so much for this time.
Good morning, Annie. It's been a real pleasure to be invited once again. And certainly the past 3 days have been very intensive, but also very rewarding.
Yeah. So again, I cannot emphasize enough how much of a joy and an honor it is to have you on the committee. So perhaps before I ask you a few questions, let me just remind our audience of what the selection committee does, which now you're familiar with. So we deeply respect our committee because they perform an extremely important task of making funding recommendations to the Right Foundation. And as you know, Right Foundation requires all of our applicants to pursue not just developing essential vaccines, drugs, and diagnostics, but to commit to obtaining appropriate policy recommendations so that those valuable products could be made available within local public health systems as global public good. In other words, our SC members have the tough task of evaluating proposals first based on their technical merits, but also their potential to indeed obtain appropriate policy recommendations and achieve public procurement so that they can be made available equitably. Now, what was particularly valuable about your expertise was not only you've demonstrated your expertise as a scientist, but your many years of experience serving on numerous advisory boards to guide policy recommendations, both at the national level in South Africa, but both also at the international level at WHO-SAGE. I think that many of our listeners may not be quite familiar with what WHO-SAGE does. Could you please just explain what it is and why it's so important?
So, Annie, thank you for that generous introduction. And certainly I've been a member of SAGE. This is my 7th year now. And SAGE is one of those entities which really is able to influence policy. Importantly, it's not only meant to be influencing policy in low and middle income countries, but it's meant to determine or at least advocate for policy on immunization practices globally. Now, the Scientific Advisory Group of Experts on Immunization, which is what SAGE is about, is made up of 14 members. There's 2 members from each of the WHO 7 regions, which means that I'm one of the 2 members from the African continent. The work of SAGE is really aimed towards collating, interrogating the scientific evidence, and then formulating immunization policies based on the scientific evidence. But importantly also for SAGE is that it recognizes that many high-income countries have got their own advisory committees, which usually makes recommendations for immunization practices in those countries. But for low-middle-income countries, unfortunately, there is this sort of gap in terms of expertise. And many low-middle-income country governments rely on SAGE recommendations in determining their own immunization policies. Another important component of SAGE is when they interrogate the data, they ensure that the data is generalizable. And I think that's really important because often when clinical trials are done, they are done predominantly in high-income countries, despite many of the targets of those vaccines being aimed at protecting lives, which predominantly occur in low-income countries. So you've got a sort of paradox. So what SAGE also interrogates is to ensure that the data are generalizable to settings which are most likely to have the greatest benefit from the introduction of those vaccines. So it sort of plays an important role in terms of equity, both in ensuring that there's equity with regard to data itself, as well as when it comes to equity around the deployment of vaccines. So as an example, during COVID-19, which was a very difficult period, one of the major discussions that took place at SAGE is that whilst high-income countries such as the US and even Canada were deploying vaccines for the high-risk populations, but also starting to target children. At the same time, there was no vaccine that was being deployed in low and middle-income countries. So you had this unacceptable situation where there was widespread deployment of COVID-19 vaccines in high-income countries, including to sectors of the population that weren't really being at risk of severe disease or dying. But on the other hand, you had all of these high-risk individuals on African continent as well as some South Asian countries that were at high risk that simply didn't have access to the scarce commodity. So under those circumstances, SAGE is quite vociferous that there needs to be greater equity, there needs to be greater efficiency in the limited supply of vaccine that we might have at a point in time. So it plays an important advocacy role, but it also plays an important translational role in terms of determining, or at least advising on immunization practices, immunization policy. And as I said, many low-income countries, low-middle-income countries are highly dependent on the SAGE recommendations in determining whether or not they would actually incorporate vaccines, including what type of schedules to use as an example.
I think you've just touched upon a few aspects that make up the core of the Right Foundation's mission. So we've just heard the importance of not just generating rigorous scientific evidence to guide immunization policy, but translating that evidence equitably, not just to the wealthiest parts of the world, and ensuring that generalizability, that really requires a different lens. And I can assure you that the Right Foundation is deeply aligned with that core mission, because we would like to make sure that our funded products aren't just produced as just another private commodities that are bought and sold in any private market. They should not be luxury goods. So thank you for highlighting that.
I mean, just to add on that, so when you did invite me to join the Right Foundation 3 years ago, just over 3 years ago, we had this brief chat about what the Right Foundation is about. And certainly coming from South Africa to Seoul is a long journey, so I would really need to be interested in the entire sort of agenda for me to really sort of make a sacrifice in terms of time. And what was really appealing to me when we chatted was exactly what you said, is that this wasn't something coming from one region to another region which was being sort of exploitative, but rather what you had set out as being the agenda of the Right Foundation is one of co-creation with partners in the South. And I think that co-creation is an important dimension toward the Right Foundation. And I think it's one of the few foundations that I've been involved in that is very purposeful in terms of ensuring that there's mutual respect between collaborators, that there needs to be collaborators from low middle income countries. And it's sort of important, what Right Foundation does really well is to interrogate the meaningfulness of that collaboration. So it's not just about putting a collaborator down on paper, but really ensuring that the collaborators are going to benefit from the relationship with the South Korean entity, as well as the collaborators being able to take some sort of ownership in terms of the design, and obviously bringing their own expertise. So I think that aspect of the Right Foundation is something which I truly respect and something which needs to be nurtured.
Thank you. We see that as, on one hand, a vote of confidence in where we are headed, but I humbly acknowledge that we have a long way to go, so we would really need support from experts like you. But we are definitely committed in expanding, as you say, not just collaborating for the sake of doing something similar together, but the commitment to learning together, co-creation.
Right.
It's something that is extremely inspiring for Right, and something that we understand is not easy, that we are committed to pursuing. But thank you for that nudge. We need that nudge. Now, I'm going to now ask us to take a step back and reflect a little bit on how vaccine R&D has been conducted in the past. Vaccine R&D, as you know, has been conducted for decades. I would dare say that perhaps it's only in the recent decade or so where the awareness for driving vaccine R&D for public health and health equity, that's quite recent. That would be my assessment. Then we were hit by the pandemic. So with your perspective, how well have we been doing? Is our approach evolving? Should it evolve? Do we need a little bit of a rethink in the way that we conduct or fund vaccine R&D if we want to really drive it towards public health and health equity as a field at large? What do you think?
Yeah, so that's a really important question. As you mentioned, I've been involved in vaccine research and particularly the clinical development of vaccine for the past 30 years, since 1997. And things have transformed over that period of time, but the transformation has been way too slow. So where did we start off when I started in vaccine, and what was I experiencing? Way back in 1997, 1998, there was this vaccine that was being developed to protect against the most common cause of death in children, that was pneumococcal pneumonia. And the vaccine that was developed was the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine. The nature of clinical trial activities and the development of the vaccine is much of the basic science research then, and unfortunately even now, really takes place in high-income countries, which is sort of a skill gap that needs to be addressed. But what used to happen then is that the clinical trials that were being done were done exclusively in high-income countries with absolutely no participation or any sites in low and middle-income countries. So that lends itself obviously towards a bias in terms of the generalizability of the data. But more importantly, that lends itself also to a situation where SAGE of WHO is unable to make a recommendation for the use of that vaccine in low and middle income countries because you don't know how that vaccine is going to perform in low and middle income countries. So what are the consequences of that sort of approach? What happened with the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, which used to cause about 750,000 children to die each year under the age of 5, and almost 95% of that was in low middle income countries, is it took another 10 to 15 years between the time when the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine was introduced in high income countries compared with when it was introduced where it was needed the most, in low and middle income countries, which is totally unacceptable. That was perhaps a bit better than an earlier vaccine, the Haemophilus influenza conjugate vaccine, which took 20 years between the time when it was introduced in high income countries compared to low middle income countries. So when there isn't this research and development, and when there isn't vaccine manufacture taking place in low and middle income countries, it lends itself to these anomalous situations where vaccines are being developed, or at least being advocated at being developed to save lives, but the lives are not being saved because there's a delay in the deployment of those vaccines in the settings where it's required the most. Now, things have transformed over the years, and I think, again, WHO SAGE was an important entity that made sure that industry became more sensitive to these issues. That WHO SAGE was not going to make a recommendation for the deployment of vaccines into settings where the vaccines were not evaluated. And I think WHO played an important advocacy role and were able to sort of influence the mindset of industry that for your vaccine to be used and to do what it's set out to do, which is to save lives and protect against severe disease, you need to make sure your data is generalizable. And to some extent, the regulatory authorities also came to accept that you can't have a vaccine that's tried out in the US in a predominantly Caucasian white population and then deployed even in the US where there might be differences in terms of the effectiveness of the vaccine in different population groups. Now, like I said, things have transformed. We've seen many more of these clinical trials involving multiple countries from across different WHO regions, including from the African setting. And the clinical trial capacity development has evolved, which is an important component if we're wanting to sort of expedite things into the future. But where we still haven't made much progress, at least on the African continent, in South Asia, they certainly have made progress in countries such as South Korea, India, Indonesia, is around the vaccine manufacture. And unless we can get it right around Africa becoming self-sustainable when it comes to vaccine manufacture, we're going to have the same sort of contradictions that we face during COVID-19. So there's some manufacturing capacity on the African continent, including in South Africa, but largely at the final stage of the vaccine manufacture, which is a full and finished component. But what ended up happening is that we had a tech transfer taking place to South Africa for one of the COVID-19 vaccines. The vaccines, millions of doses that were full and finished in South Africa didn't have access to it because the nature of the tech transfer was that you will do this for us, but we retain ownership of the vaccine and we determine where the vaccine will be deployed. So we had now full and finished taking place in South Africa, but those vaccines were not accessible to South Africans or the African continent. So those are some of the tensions that still exist, which we need to deal with. But I think COVID-19 really was the wake-up call. So things have progressed over the past 30 years, and I don't want to make COVID-19 as being the turning point, but it has, to some extent, it is an inflection point in that with experience, where COVID-19 vaccines only became available on the African continent after there was widespread infection-induced immunity, and where vaccines had very additional role to play in preventing death. I think governments on the African continent started to get a wake-up call, and they had this wake-up call previously in 2009 with the H1N1 swine flu pandemic. There was some sort of political noise that Africa needs to become self-sustainable. Nothing much came out of that, despite many African governments making a commitment to that agenda. But after the COVID-19 pandemic, and with a large number of individuals that died as compared to the swine flu pandemic, I think that was much more of a wake-up call. But it was not just a wake-up call for African governments. It was also a wake-up call for the global scientific community, including at the level of WHO, including at the level of industry partners. And they've now come to realize that to mitigate what resulted during COVID-19 with regard to the inequity of distribution of vaccines, there has to be self-sustainability when it comes to vaccine manufacture. So there's a number of green shoot projects currently on the African continent. And for me, that is what needs to be nurtured. And just the experience that I've had on the Right Foundation, reviewing some of the proposals, what really strikes me is just the ability of the biotechs in South Korea to bring about efficiency to manufacturing processes, to sort of really streamline things. And I think that sort of expertise, it's a gold mine. And it's something that would be of massive sort of relevance to the African continent. And for me, one of the important steps is to become perhaps a bit more purposeful. How the tech transfer might take place, agnostic of any product, which is sort of a completely different approach that we currently use. And currently it's product-based. The question is, can we set up some sort of a funding mechanism that enables biotech companies in South Korea to work with biotech startups on African continent, specifically focus around sort of assisting them to set up vaccine manufacturing capabilities.
You're raising a lot of points that will keep the Right Foundation very busy. That's a perfect segue to my next question. It's related from my previous question on the lessons learned from the pandemic, but I would like to zero in a little bit more on partnerships. Partnerships, in my view, are desirable in most cases. There's something very powerful about collective efforts rather than doing things in isolation all by yourself. But for vaccine R&D, and especially if the goal of vaccine R&D is to serve public health and health equity globally, Right Foundation deeply appreciates that collaboration is not just a nice to have, but necessity purely from the product development lens. As you know very well, there's so many steps to go from basic research and translating that basic findings into a preclinical candidate and generating clinical evidence to prove the effectiveness. And once the research and development are done, as you say, manufacturing, policy recommendation, and the toughest piece, governments now sustainably running successful immunization programs to make sure that it has a real impact on public health and health equity. So there's so many pieces there. So looking at all those elements, why is partnership particularly important for vaccine R&D, for researchers, funders, industry, governments? What do you think?
So I think I'm going to limit my comments in relation to the activities of the Wright Foundation, because that's a space that we obviously looking at the moment. And it's, again, I mentioned earlier, it's about co-creation, and it's about being able to, in a sense, leverage and exploit the different skill sets which different groups are able to bring. So what really strikes me, as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to the biotech companies in South Korea, is I believe they're tremendously innovative. They have the technology, they're able to adapt the technology for a particular purpose. But at the same time, what perhaps needs to be strengthened is the understanding, the contextualizing of how best the technology can be used. So the natural partner for that is someone that is coming from an area that have experience on a particular disease, that's able to sort of see whether there will be a good fit in terms of the technology that's being proposed compared with what the aim of that final product is going to be. So that sort of is what co-creation is all about. It's bringing, leveraging on different skill sets. Ideally, over time, we're wanting greater R&D on the African continent. We're wanting manufacturing capacity, but that is not a 5-year project. That is a decade, 2-decade project. It's going to be a long time. In that period of time, I think by nurturing this sort of collaborations between South Korean biotechs as well as scientists and scientists from the African continent, whose skill set is more in the space of epidemiology, clinical development of vaccines. They've got massive capacity when it comes to being able to do clinical trials, and that is just growing by the day across the African continent. That is what biotech companies can leverage on from the African continent. But in the other direction, it's about African scientists being able to assist the biotech companies in terms of understanding what is the problem. It's more than what you just read about in a journal article. You need to understand really what is the problem on the ground, how adaptable is the technology that is being proposed. Obviously, there's issues related to cost, but there's also issues related to acceptance, not just at the level of government, but also at the level of the community, also at the level of healthcare workers. And that sort of insight would be useful in terms of ensuring that the products that we develop don't just remain on the shelves, but actually do what it is designed to be done, designed for. So I think that sort of co-creation is really where we need to be strengthening. And to some extent, the question arises, so over the past 3 years, and I think before then, my sense is that many of these sort of collaborations are people reaching out to someone else and not necessarily to the right people. And I think that becomes a problem. So it might be someone that someone has met in a meeting that sort of expresses some interest rather than a true expert in a particular branch that would be able to bring much more value to those discussions and sort of avoid some of the issues we experience in some of our proposals. So I think the question is whether Wright Foundation, as part of its forward plans, should become much more purposeful in terms of introducing, not setting up collaborations, but rather introducing scientists that have got expertise in specific disease areas that are of interest to the Wright Foundation and introducing them to the biotech companies. And it might well be a 2 or 3 day meeting where you have thematic areas that you basically present. We've got presenters from Africa, from South Asia presenting. These are the problems that we're experiencing, and biotech companies will say, well, these are the possible solutions that we might have. How can we actually make it work? So I think becoming more purposeful in our collaborations is important. But again, important to that collaboration is that it can't be exploitative. It can't be a one-way stream. It needs to be out of understanding that each party brings an equal importance to that collaboration. But there also needs to be a longer-term vision in that collaboration eventually needs to relate to transfer of skill in both directions. Because I think it's important for South Korea, for academics in South Korea,
Yeah.
also to become subject experts rather than needing to rely on subject experts from the South.
In other words, partnerships that are anchored in the value of co-creation. But I've heard something that is very valuable here. An important guide is co-creation actually needs a very purposeful approach. It needs understanding of complementary strengths, not just having a lot of people in the same room and have them meet up and work together. So it needs to be much more purposeful in correctly understanding the areas of complementarity. The role that you've seen for Korea is its excellence in engineering, process development, manufacturing, and where South African partners could bring is expertise in epidemiology as well as the clinical studies capabilities to really contextualize innovation. I thought I've known you well, but I think the insights I've learned during the last hour has been greatly, it has exceeded what I thought I was going to learn. Thank you. And I hope you have a safe trip back to South Africa. And I look so much forward to relying on you during the next round of selection committee meetings.
Thank you for having me and really enjoyed working with yourself.
Thank you.